Hey guys, Abel here, back with another video, and in this one I would like to talk about deloads, and more specifically why I don't typically do deloads as it's traditionally prescribed by many fitness professionals, and I will also be going into what I'm doing instead. So if this sounds good, let's get into it. So just so we are all clear on what I'm actually talking about, what do I mean by traditional deloads? Well, typically the way these are prescribed is that every 4 to 12 weeks, you take a lower volume phase where you roughly maintain the intensities you were doing before, but you're reducing the amount of reps you're doing in a given set by 1 rep or 2, and you're also cutting the amount of sets you're doing by half. So maybe last week you were doing 4 sets of bench presses, and on your top set, depending on how you're programming, on your top set you were doing 10 reps, and this week on your deload week you would be only doing 2 sets of bench presses instead of 4, and on your top set instead of 10 you would be capping it at 8 reps, something like that. And the purposes of these deload phases is to manage fatigue, reduce injury risk, and to overall rejuvenate your body and to get yourself ready for another training block. And so what I want to do is dissect this deloading model to its elements, address each point, and throw in my contentions, and then we can go from there. And I also want to make the caveat that this video really applies to intermediate / pretty advanced, pretty well trained, but still average Joe gym warriors. There certainly might be some exotic strength levels and degrees of training advancement where these things that I'm going to be addressing in this video might not apply. So if some coach tunes into this video and says, yo, but I have a guy that I'm training who is bench pressing 300 kilos and I need to deload him every 4 weeks, sure, like there might be things that this video just doesn't apply for. So I just want to throw this caveat in for the beginning. So first of all, let's start with the time frame, every 4 to 12 weeks. In my opinion, if you need to deload as frequently as every 4 to 6 weeks, then I think you're either being a bit too conservative and you're holding yourself back needlessly, which can be fine if you don't inherently enjoy training and for you training is just a means to an end. You're training to get a certain result, but if you could get your dream body with a click of a switch, then you wouldn't necessarily train in the gym because you don't inherently enjoy the process, then it can be fine. But if you actually enjoy the process of training, then I think you're holding yourself back unnecessarily. Or if deloading in your case is actually warranted that frequently, then you're probably just doing too much and you could actually make more continuous progress without the need to insert that many deloads that frequently. I'm going to elaborate on this a bit more shortly, but that would be the time frame component of it briefly. The next thing I want to get into is the actual model of how you're applying the deload, and that is maintaining intensity and reducing volume. I think that if your problem or the need for your deload is that you overreached, which is mostly related to volume, then it will definitely help with that. If your issues are related to managing connective tissue stress or reducing injury risk, then in my opinion, it just doesn't do a very good job with that because you're still lifting similarly heavy weights, you're only reducing the volume. So you're still kind of stressing the joints and your connective tissue. And if your goal is to reduce injury risk, then I think you could actually make a much better job by either taking a complete rest phase, not training at all, or maybe doing some really light speed work, which accumulates basically 0 fatigue. It still gives you some nice technical practice and basically gives a total break for your connective tissue. Or you could actually be continuing to train hard and doing a phase of really light load, high rep, pump work type training, which still allows you to make gains in terms of hypertrophy, but gives a total break for your connective tissue, or almost total break, and does wonders for tissue healing and regeneration of your tendons and ligaments and joints. And one thing I would note about this model of maintaining intensity and reducing volume a lot is that psychologically it just sucks so badly, which by itself doesn't necessarily mean anything. I mean, if you want to make good progress, then at certain times you need to ignore your own personal preferences. But if something sucks this badly, and if you ask me, it sucks total ass. I mean, you still need to go to the gym, it takes up time, but you're not actually training enough to grow, then you have to have a good reason to actually apply that method. And in my opinion, there is just not a good enough reason to apply this method specifically. I really think that this is one of those things that originated from strength sports, where this model makes a lot more sense because you need to go to the gym and you need to maintain your technique and you need to maintain specificity by lifting heavy enough. And you often need to peak for a given event. So these lower volume, similar intensity phases make a lot more sense in there. And I think it's one of those things that kind of got transferred over to hypertrophy training as well. And it kind of makes sense because a lot of people that are experts in hypertrophy training are also into strength sports like powerlifting, for example. And then the last thing I want to dissect is the actual goal of the deload, which is fatigue management, because that's a bit of an umbrella term. And basically it can mean whatever we want it to mean. So if fatigue management means reducing injury risk and giving your connective tissue a break, that is by and large happens during your time in the gym as opposed to your times outside of the gym. In other words, injury management is something that should always be in the back of your mind when you're setting up your program and when you're in the gym, as opposed to something that you're only trying to manage during these rest periods or deloads. I really like what Joe Bennett, the hypertrophy coach, says about injuries, is that while yes, there are some freak accidents that happen every once in a while, but injuries by and large happen by using exercises or lifting techniques that just don't really agree with your body and biomechanics. Then you multiply this by volume and then frequency and then weights lifted. You add weeks and months and years of training like this, and that's when injuries accumulate sneakily over time. A very obvious classic example in my case is overhead tricep extensions, where with every single rep that I'm doing, I can feel this nasty elbow click. And literally every rep is one unit of elbow stress and another unit of elbow stress. And basically every single time I'm doing this movement, it brings me one step closer of developing elbow tendinosis. Adding some stubbornness on top of that will actually result in a serious elbow injury if I'm doing it for long enough. So yeah, I might be able to get around this somewhat by inserting some deloads and taking some weeks off here and there when things get really bad. But by and large, the best way to prevent an elbow injury from happening is to actually not do overhead tricep extensions, but do something else instead. And even if shit happens, and let's say I do become a bit stubborn and I keep doing overhead tricep extensions, even though my elbows get pissed off, and I do develop some elbow tendinosis, it doesn't necessarily mean that I can't keep doing squats or leg extensions or calf raises or whatever. Other parts of my body might be completely fine to train and I can keep progressing with them. So that by itself doesn't necessarily warrant an actual deload. So that's the connective tissue side of it. But deloads are also used to just mitigate training stress and to break through plateaus and to prevent yourself from hitting a wall in your training when you're just not going anywhere. So first of all, going back to something I said in the beginning, I think that if you need to deload really frequently to prevent yourself from overreaching, then the amount of volume that you have in your program is just not sustainable to begin with. Many people, when they hear that I don't deload every 4 to 5 weeks or so, or even necessarily every 8 weeks, then they ask me, so do you not accumulate fatigue in your training? And my response to it is, yes, I do accumulate fatigue, but only as much fatigue as is able to dissipate by the time my next training session rolls around. I really think that that, by and large, is a dose and frequency issue. And what I mean by that is, if you're doing an amount of work for a given muscle group in a training session that would require 5 days of recovery, and then you want to train that muscle group again after 2 days, then yeah, progress is going to be very difficult and you're always going to find yourself in this limbo of either overreaching or just being able to get away with it and keep progressing. But I think that if you're smart with your programming and you're dosing out your volume and frequency properly, then you will be able to recover and adapt to the training stress that you impose upon yourself in one session by the time your next training session is rolling around. Moreover, there are many potential reasons why you might hit a bit of a wall in your training, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with overreaching or overtraining or anything related to you having done too much. Of course, there are some obvious ones, like you just had a bad night of sleep, or you didn't eat well, or you're feeling under the weather and you just don't realize it in the moment and you go in and have a shitty training session. But there are also times, it happens to me sometimes, that I slept well, I ate well, and I just go in there and my mind is elsewhere. I just don't have it. I just don't have that that would allow me to really push myself hard in my session, and I lose a couple of reps on a given lift. And it doesn't mean that I overreached. It just means that I just don't have it that day. I will lose that couple of reps, and then I will come back a few days later and I will hit a massive PR again. Also, many times you will hit a plateau on a given lift, and often it just has to do with the fact that you just became very advanced on that given lift based on your genetics, and you will just have to become much smarter with the way you program. Maybe you will have to implement things like DUP, so daily undulating periodization. Maybe the rep range you're doing for that given lift is just not sustainable anymore, and you will have to do a more intense rep range, so you will have to reduce the amount of reps you're doing, so you're training at a higher intensity level for that lift to keep progressing. Or it could actually mean that expecting progress on that given lift as frequently as you did before is just not realistic anymore. For example, I hit some plateaus on my weighted chin-ups not long ago. For a while, I was stuck at 115 kilos in total, so body weight plus added weight, of course, for 6 reps. So what I did was implemented 2 different rep ranges, and also the reason why I said 115 kilos as opposed to a 26 kilo dumbbell or something like that is because I realized that if I'm using such a blunt number, like just the external weight that I'm adding as opposed to the whole weight that I'm lifting, that means that I can't be as meticulous with micro-loading the increments with which I'm progressing. And when your progress on a given lift on which you became pretty advanced slows down quite a bit, then you have to be pretty meticulous with the percentage increases in load that you're lifting week after week. So I implemented a couple of plateau breaker strategies, for example, intensifying the lift a little bit, so lifting in a lower rep range sometimes. Also, I added in 2 different rep ranges instead of just 1, became more meticulous with the micro-loading, and sure enough, I kept progressing in my chin-ups. And also what's important to keep in mind is that it's unlikely that my chin-up plateau occurred because my lats or my biceps were overtrained, because other lifts for those muscle groups were progressing just fine. I apologize, by the way, I do realize that sometimes I'm saying progressing instead of progressing, but you get the point. So with having my contentions out of the way for the traditional deloading model, let's get into what I prefer to do instead. The first line of action is something that Menno Henselmans wrote about, is autoregulatory volume training, which is just a fancy way of saying that you're letting your loads drop as you get fatigued in your training sessions. That is super useful because this way, the amount of volume that you're doing in a given session is going to autoregulate itself based on how fatigued or fresh you are in a given training session. If you feel on top of the world in a given session and you slept well, ate well, timed your caffeine intake right, then you might do double the volume than on another session where you might be more fatigued and your reps are dropping really, really quickly. Another thing which Menno also wrote about, and this is also something that Børge Fagerli uses a lot, is called reactive deloading. And that is, if you don't progress as planned on certain lifts, then you're skipping the remaining sets for that exercise in that session. So for example, if you're squatting and deadlifting a lot of weight already, and you can't even add 1 pound or 2 pounds to the bar, then that is most probably because you're uniquely fatigued in that given situation. And instead of digging yourself into an even deeper recovery hole, it's better to just skip the remaining sets of that exercise. This is especially suited for exercises that are micro-loadable really well, and progress on them tends to be pretty linear, like squats, deadlift variations, hip thrusts, these kinds of lifts. Now, some people might say that autoregulation is going to take care of everything and there is never a need to do pre-planned deloads. I think that there is value in being preemptive sometimes and rather being safe than sorry. And I do think that you don't want to wait until your car breaks down to have your oil changed analogy has some merit, simply for the reason that sometimes injuries do accumulate in a way that you don't even realize them. Sometimes everything feels fine and you keep making progress and you're making increases in your lifts, but you're actually sneakily developing some connective tissue issues which all of a sudden manifest itself in an injury. So for that reason, I do think that it's good to have some rest phases here and there. I also think that these rest phases have a lot of value psychologically. I know that when I take a week off every once in a while, for example, during traveling or something, my motivation and enthusiasm to make good progress again is better than ever. Sometimes you just get into a rut with your training where you become stale. You get into the gym and it's the same environment, same training sessions, same exercises that you're doing over and over again. And even though you love training and you enjoy the process, sometimes it just gets old. I also think that there is a lot of value just to change up your training, not necessarily all the exercises and to go for the muscle confusion nonsense, but to implement some higher rep training phase, for example, which again, still allows you to push yourself hard, make gains, but it gives your connective tissue a lot of break and allows you to rejuvenate the joints and ligaments that might be degenerating underneath and you don't even realize it. So I'm definitely not mocking the idea of doing some preemptive things in training and take some precautionary actions, even though some glaring problem is not staring you in the face like an injury or a complete stagnation in all lifts and all exercises. Sometimes it's better to be safe than sorry. But if we are talking about deloads, then I would much rather have someone take a complete rest phase, even if it's just a couple of days or maybe a week or two, or maybe do some high rep phase, do some pump work, allow some connective tissue regeneration. But the traditional deloading model, which can be really frequent and also the way it's applied, I'm not a huge fan of. Well, I guess I explained in this video why I'm not doing those. So I hope this video shed some light on my take on deloads. Probably I've not been able to cover everything. If I missed something that would have been important to address in this video, please let me know in the comment section. Otherwise, I hope you found this useful and interesting at least. If you liked the video, drop a like. If you disliked it, drop a dislike. As always, troll me, I'll troll you back. Subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and with that, see you next time.